Have you ever heard a simple sentence, something ordinary, yet it hits a place you've carefully kept hidden? Not because it was wrong, but because it was so true, you couldn't pretend anymore. Sometimes it only takes a stranger, someone who knows nothing about your past, to say the one thing everyone else was too afraid to speak. And in that one moment, your whole world stops. If you've ever been caught off guard by a memory, triggered by just a few unexpected words, hit that like button and subscribe, because today's story is exactly that: a quiet breakfast, a passing comment from a waitress, and a father who spent years running from his wife's memory, until someone finally saw what he couldn't. The plane touched down in Portland just as the sky began to shift from charcoal gray to a weary orange blush. It had been a long flight, the last leg of a business trip that Jonathan Mercer hadn't wanted to take, but couldn't avoid. A few deals closed, a few meetings delayed, and in the middle of it all, an 8-year-old girl with quiet eyes and tangled thoughts, trailing after her father like the last thread holding him together. Lily held his hand tightly as they stepped off the jet bridge, her small fingers clutching his like she was anchoring herself. She didn't complain, not once. Even though the flight had been long. Even though it was still too early for breakfast. Even though she hadn't slept well, shifting in her seat while her father worked through emails, blind to her restlessness. Jonathan checked his watch, squinting at the hour. Too early for their hotel check-in. Too early to call anyone. He rubbed his temple and sighed. "There's a diner right by the exit," he muttered, half to himself. Lily nodded, her backpack bouncing lightly as she walked beside him. She wasn't the kind of child to whine or pout. She never really had been. There was a kind of gentleness in her bones that made strangers think she was shy. But she wasn't. She was simply careful. Careful with her words. Careful with her questions. Careful not to ask about things that made her father's jaw tighten and his voice go flat. The diner was almost empty, just a couple of red-eyed travelers hunched over their phones and a man in a business suit already halfway through his eggs. Jonathan slid into a corner booth and dropped his bag beside him with a thud. Lily climbed into the seat across, her small frame sinking into the cushioned bench like a whisper. She pulled her hair tie from her wrist and quickly looped it around her hair, tying it low at the nape of her neck. Jonathan caught a glimpse, the soft shape of her face, the way her glasses framed her eyes, the quiet tilt of her smile as she nodded politely at the waitress approaching. There was something about that moment. Something familiar. He blinked and looked away. Lily picked up the menu without saying much. Her eyes scanned the breakfast section, but she already knew what she wanted. She always ordered the same thing when they traveled: pancakes, with strawberries if they had them. And orange juice. Always orange juice. Jonathan didn't even open his menu. Coffee. Black, he said when the waitress came by. She jotted it down and gave a tired smile. "I'll get that started for you." As she walked away, Lily glanced around the diner. Her eyes weren't searching for anything in particular, just taking in the world with that calm observation she'd inherited from someone Jonathan tried hard not to think about. From someone she looked more and more like every day. He didn't notice it all the time. Not unless she laughed a certain way, or pushed her glasses up with the back of her hand, just like her mother used to. But sitting across from her now, in the soft hush of an early morning diner, Jonathan felt it like a weight. Not painful exactly. Just heavy. Like something unpaid. She smiled again, this time directly at the waitress returning with syrup and a refill of coffee for the man at the counter. It was such a small smile. Polite. Easy. But for a fraction of a second, it made Jonathan's breath catch. He looked down at the table, suddenly feeling like the booth was closing in. The pancakes came quickly. 3 soft, golden rounds stacked neatly with a drizzle of butter melting down the sides. Lily thanked the waitress in that same quiet voice, her words barely more than a breath, and reached for the syrup without a glance at her father. She poured carefully, not too much, just enough to coat the top, then picked up her fork and began eating in small, deliberate bites. Jonathan didn't touch the menu. His coffee sat in front of him, steaming quietly. He lifted the cup to his lips, holding it there longer than he needed to, the ceramic warming his hands. He didn't speak. Neither did she. It wasn't awkward. Not exactly. More like a ritual they'd fallen into, a rhythm of words unspoken, of shared silences that both protected and divided them. Across the table, Lily chewed thoughtfully. She kept her eyes on the plate, but every now and then she glanced up, just for a second, like she wanted to say something, but thought better of it. Jonathan didn't meet her gaze. He couldn't. The light filtering through the diner windows was soft now, brushing across her hair, catching in the lenses of her glasses. She looked so much like her mother sitting there, more than he could admit. It wasn't just the shape of her mouth or the way her shoulders curved inward slightly when she concentrated. It was the stillness. The quiet strength. He sipped his coffee and stared past her, at a spot just over her shoulder. The booth behind her was empty, but his mind filled it easily. He saw long fingers tapping the table absently, a warm laugh he hadn't heard in 3 years. He remembered Sunday mornings and the way she used to hold Lily's hand under the table, tracing circles on the back of her tiny palm. Now, that same hand was in front of him, reaching for another bite of pancake. He blinked, hard. Lily didn't say much when they traveled. She was good at reading the temperature of a room, especially when that room was her father. And this morning, she sensed the fog in him. She didn't try to break through it. She just sat with it. Sometimes that was all you could do. The waitress returned briefly, refilling Jonathan's coffee without a word. He nodded, murmured thanks, then went back to staring at the swirl of cream he hadn't asked for. The silence stretched on. Lily swung her feet lightly beneath the table. Her sneakers didn't quite touch the floor. For a moment, Jonathan looked up. Her smile caught him off guard. It wasn't wide or showy, just a tiny curve of the mouth as she wiped syrup from her chin and looked at him like she was trying to pull him back from somewhere far away. It was the same smile her mother used to give him when he was lost in thought. The same one that once made him believe that no matter how bad things got, there was always someone waiting on the other side. He looked away again, heart twisting. The seat across from him, this very booth, had once been filled by a woman who could disarm him with a single glance. Now, that seat held echoes. And a little girl growing into those echoes more every day. The coffee tasted bitter. Or maybe that was just regret. Marian had worked the morning shift at that diner for nearly 7 years. She had seen business travelers come and go, watched couples break up over burnt toast, and comforted more crying toddlers than she could count. But there was something different about the pair in booth 7 that morning. Maybe it was the way the man stared into his coffee like it had secrets to tell. Or maybe it was the girl, small, composed, eating her pancakes with a kind of stillness that didn't belong to someone so young. Marian passed their table 3 times before she spoke. The first time, she brought the coffee. The second, she checked to see if Lily needed more syrup. The third, she brought it. As she reached across the table to set down the small glass bottle, she paused. Just for a moment. The girl looked up, her fork resting gently on the edge of her plate. There was syrup on the corner of her mouth and a quiet softness in her expression. And Marian saw it. Clear as day. It wasn't just the resemblance, though it was striking. It was something deeper. The way her eyes waited, not just looked. The way her smile was polite but hesitant, like someone who had learned early on to tread carefully around grown-ups' emotions. Marianne's voice was low, unhurried. "You look just like your mom," she said. The words hung there for a second, not sharp, not dramatic, just honest. Gentle. As if she were offering a truth instead of a compliment. Lily blinked. Not startled. Just thoughtful. Jonathan didn't move. Marianne didn't linger. She smiled, not the kind of smile waitresses wear to get better tips, but the kind that says, "I saw something I thought you should know." Then she turned and walked back toward the kitchen. It wasn't meant to be a big moment. Not to her. She hadn't known what had happened in that family, Didn't know about the woman they'd lost or the weight that man carried around like an invisible suitcase he never put down. She didn't know why the girl's quietness wasn't just her nature, but her defense. But Marianne had a way of seeing people. Not their wallets or their orders, but the little things they didn't say. And in that moment, watching the girl brush her hair behind her ear with the back of her hand, the way some women did when they were trying not to cry, Marianne just knew. It wasn't flattery. It wasn't small talk. It was something more ancient, more instinctual. Like a chord had been struck without warning. Back at the counter, she refilled a pot of coffee and didn't look back. At the table, Lily took another bite of pancake, slower now. Jonathan still hadn't moved. His cup sat untouched in front of him, the steam now fading into thin air. His fingers curled slightly around the handle, but his eyes were far away. Not on the syrup, not on Lily, but on something inside him that had just been called out without permission. Jonathan heard the words. Not just vaguely, not like background chatter or the way you half-register a song in an elevator. No, he heard them. Fully. Clearly. As if someone had whispered them straight into the quietest part of him. You look just like your mom. The sentence rang out inside his chest louder than it had in the air. And yet it hadn't been loud at all. Marianne had said it gently, almost like an afterthought. But to Jonathan, it landed with the weight of a bell tolling in a cavern, where echoes had nowhere else to go. His hand froze mid-motion, the coffee cup suspended between table and lips. Steam curled in the space between his fingers and his mouth, but he didn't move. His eyes widened, not dramatically, not in panic. Just enough that anyone really watching would see the edges of a dam start to crack. He hadn't heard those words in over 3 years. Not since the funeral. Not since he had stood in a stiff black suit beside a small casket of white roses, and received the kind of condolences that sound like apologies for not knowing what else to say. No one had said she looked like her mother. No one had dared. Not even him. Because it wasn't just a sentence. It was a door. And once that door opened, once that comparison was made, it meant acknowledging not just who had been lost, but what was left behind. What lived on. And how much he had tried not to see it. Across the table, Lily kept eating, unfazed. She didn't catch what had just happened inside her father. Or maybe she did, and chose not to show it. But Jonathan couldn't move. It wasn't that he was angry. Marianne hadn't meant harm. That much was obvious. She hadn't said it with judgment or pity. She didn't know. That was what made it all the more devastating. She didn't know, and still she saw. She had walked by, glanced at Lily's face, and spoken the one truth everyone else had avoided for years. A waitress in a diner, with no idea what landmine she'd just stepped on, or maybe unknowingly disarmed. Jonathan's throat tightened. Not enough to choke, just enough to freeze the air in place. His hand slowly lowered the coffee cup back to the table. He didn't drink. Didn't blink. Just stared ahead as if the walls had shifted and no one else noticed. A part of him wanted to get up. Leave. Take Lily's hand and escape the moment before it rooted itself too deep. But something in him stayed. Anchored. Caught in the soft finality of words that couldn't be unsaid. The diner around him went on, the low buzz of a morning radio, the clink of silverware, the shuffle of menus being closed. But to Jonathan, it all went silent. Because for the first time in years, someone had spoken her back into the room. And that changed everything. The sentence still echoed in Jonathan's chest, but now it was doing something else, something he hadn't expected. It was unraveling things. Slowly. Quietly. Like the first tug on a loose thread. He blinked. Once. Twice. And then the diner vanished. Not physically. The clatter of dishes and hum of conversation were still around him, but his mind had already slipped somewhere else. Somewhere softer. Somewhere harder. He saw her. Not in the polished way his memory usually preserved her, all posed smiles and golden hour light, but in the Messier realer ways he hadn't let himself remember in years. She was sitting on the living room carpet, cross-legged, with Lily in her lap. Their daughter was maybe 2, maybe 3. Her hair was in uneven pigtails, tied off with red ribbons that didn't match. The kind of hurried hairstyle only a mother who was running late could create, and still make look like magic. She had been humming something. A tune he couldn't place now. Lily had her hands on her mom's cheeks, squishing them gently while giggling. And she, his wife, had laughed. That slanted smile, the one that only showed on the left side of her face, had appeared without hesitation. Jonathan hadn't thought of that moment in years. And now it played on loop in his mind, clear, immediate, intimate. A real unspooling from some corner of his memory he'd boarded up long ago. He remembered how, after the funeral, he'd packed all her clothes into boxes. Not out of necessity, but urgency. Like grief was contagious, and her belongings might breathe too much of it into the house. Into Lily. He'd told himself it was to protect his daughter. She was too young, he'd reasoned. Too fragile to be wrapped in memories. So he'd hidden the photo albums. Donated the scarves. Tucked away the dresses his wife used to pick out for Lily, floral ones with soft collars and buttons down the back. He told people he was simplifying things. He called it moving on. But it wasn't. It was erasure. A quiet, well-intentioned kind of disappearance. Not of his wife, but of the ways she still lived in Lily. And he saw that now. Every time Lily reached for a certain book, or tilted her head when listening, every time she crossed her legs under the table the same way her mother did, he'd flinched. Internally. Subtly. And then steered the moment somewhere else. He had never said it aloud, but he'd avoided letting Lily look like her. He'd bought new clothes, cut her bangs shorter, told himself it was just parenting. But it wasn't just that. It was fear. He was afraid that if Lily looked too much like her mother, then losing her mother hadn't just taken away a partner, it had left behind a mirror he couldn't bear to face. And in doing so, he had unintentionally denied his daughter a piece of herself. Sitting in that booth now, he realized the weight of what he had done. Or hadn't done. He hadn't let her wear the dresses. Hadn't let her see the photos. Hadn't let her see how deeply, how beautifully, she was connected to the woman who gave her life. All because he wasn't ready. Until now. Jonathan hadn't spoken in several minutes. Not since Marianne's quiet observation had cracked something open in him. The diner's soft clatter returned to his ears, like distant waves, but his attention was fixed, frighteningly, vulnerably fixed, on the girl sitting across from him. Lily wiped her hands with a napkin and took a sip of her orange juice. Then, like she timed it with something older than herself, something deep in the rhythm of the moment, she tilted her head slightly to the side. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Daddy, do I really look like Mom?" It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even curiosity in the usual sense. It was something gentler, but firmer. A child's soft invitation for truth, one that had waited a long time to be asked. Jonathan swallowed hard. He hadn't prepared for this. Not now. Not here. Not after 3 years of silence, avoidance, and half-hearted explanations. Not after shielding himself behind a wall of business trips, polite smiles, and guarded eyes. His throat closed up. His fingers tightened around his coffee cup, though it had long since gone cold. He looked at her. Really looked. The glasses. The slope of her nose. The way she sat with her hands folded neatly, thumb rubbing softly against her knuckle the way her mother always did when she was thinking. God, she did look like her. She was her, in the smallest, most breathtaking ways. Jonathan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Lily waited. No pressure. No rush. Just that same quiet, watchful calm. The kind that knew exactly how long someone had been hiding, and how gently they needed to be brought out. He cleared his throat and set the cup down. His hand trembled. Yes, he said. Just one word. But it carried 3 years of unsaid things behind it. Lily blinked. Really? He nodded slowly. Yeah. You do. A pause stretched between them. But it wasn't heavy this time. It felt like air being let into a room that had been sealed off. Jonathan leaned forward, elbows on the table. You have her eyes. The way they light up when you're figuring something out. And the way you listen, quiet first, then all at once. That's her too. He stopped himself. He hadn't planned to say any of that. But Lily smiled. Not the polite kind. A real one. The kind that curved at the corners and made her eyes crinkle just a little. I like that, she said softly. I like that I look like her. Jonathan nodded again, slower this time. So do I. And that was it. No dramatic music. No sudden flood of tears. Just a single moment of truth laid bare between father and daughter, simple, undeniable, and long overdue. It wasn't that Lily needed the confirmation. She'd probably known for a while. Kids always do. But she needed him to say it. Out loud. To name it. To stop running. And now he had. For the first time, Jonathan didn't look away from her face. He looked into it. And saw everything he'd been trying so hard not to lose, living right there in front of him. The plates had been cleared, the check paid. Lily had wandered over to the window near the entrance, her breath fogging the glass slightly as she traced patterns with her fingertip. Outside, the morning had settled into a pale, still rhythm. People walked with purpose, but in here, everything felt suspended. Jonathan stood up slowly. For a moment, he wasn't sure what he was doing, only that something inside him wouldn't let him walk out without saying something. Not today. He glanced toward the kitchen, where Marianne had disappeared a few minutes ago. She wasn't hard to find. Just behind the counter, organizing receipt slips and wiping down a tray, moving with a kind of grace that came from years of repetition and tired mornings. He approached quietly, unsure if she'd even look up. But when she did, there was no surprise in her expression, just that same steady warm attention she'd given Lily. He started, then stopped, rubbing the back of his neck. Marianne didn't rush him. Jonathan exhaled, voice softer than he expected. You were right. About what you said earlier. She gave a faint smile. Wasn't trying to be. I know. He glanced down at the counter, his fingers tapping once, then stopping. It just caught me off guard. No one said that to her. Or to me. Not since the funeral. Marianne nodded, her hands resting flat now. I figured as much. There was a pause. Then Jonathan looked up, eyes lined with something between guilt and gratitude. I've spent so long avoiding it. Trying not to see her in Lily. Thinking maybe that was protecting her somehow. He shook his head slowly. I thought if I didn't say it, if I kept it quiet, it'd hurt less. For both of us. Marianne didn't flinch. She just listened. But it didn't help, he continued. It just made everything quieter. And heavier. His words hung there a moment. I don't even know how to live with it, he said, almost to himself. Marianne tilted her head slightly. Maybe you don't have to figure it out all at once. He looked at her. She doesn't need to carry her mother's life, Marianne said gently. She's not meant to fill the space someone else left behind. Jonathan nodded, slowly. But she does need to know, Marianne added, her voice unwavering now, that looking like her mom, that being like her in all those little ways, isn't a burden. Her eyes softened. It's a gift. Jonathan didn't reply right away. He just stood there, the truth of it washing over him like warm rain after a long drought. It's funny, he said eventually, half smiling. All it took was a stranger. Marianne shrugged lightly. Sometimes that's who sees what everyone else is too close to name. He nodded again, the gesture slower this time. More grounded. Thank you. You're welcome. They didn't shake hands. There was no need. The moment had already done what it came to do. When Jonathan turned to go, there was something looser in his shoulders. Something quieter in his chest. And across the room, Lily turned from the window and smiled. The house was quiet when they returned. Not heavy quiet, but tentative, like a space waiting to see who you'd come back as. Lily had gone upstairs to unpack a few things. Jonathan lingered in the front hallway longer than he needed to, his fingers brushing the edge of a photo frame on the wall, one he usually ignored. Then he moved. Down the hall, past the kitchen, into the den where they used to spend rainy weekends building pillow forts and half-finishing puzzles. There was a closet tucked in the corner, small and unassuming, with a white door that hadn't been opened in almost 3 years. He stood there for a moment, hand on the knob. He hadn't avoided it out of superstition. There was no ritual, no conscious rule about not going in. He just stayed away. Like that one door held back the tide of everything he wasn't ready to remember. Until now. With a quiet breath, he turned the handle and pulled it open. The light inside was soft and dusty, barely filtering in from the hallway. There were plastic bins and cardboard boxes, neatly stacked. Some labeled, some not. The top one had her handwriting on it, curved, even lettering that read, "Lily's baby clothes." He didn't touch that one. Instead, he reached for the middle box. A plain cardboard one with no label at all. The tape had yellowed, the edges slightly bowed. He peeled it back carefully, like opening a letter from another lifetime. Inside were clothes. Folded sweaters. A pair of jeans with frayed hems. A scarf that still smelled faintly of lavender. And there, nestled among the softer pieces, was the green sweater. He paused. The sweater wasn't remarkable at first glance. Faded olive wool, slightly stretched at the cuffs. But it had weight. Meaning. She'd worn it the day Lily was born. He remembered her holding their daughter for the first time in that very sweater, cheeks flushed with tears and exhaustion and awe. The sleeves rolled halfway up her forearms as she cradled the child they never thought they'd have. It had been her favorite for years, soft, worn in, the kind of comfort that no price tag could replicate. Jonathan sat down on the floor. He held the sweater in both hands, fingers running slowly across the fabric. For the first time in 3 years, the touch didn't scorch him with loss. It didn't claw at his ribs or press against his lungs. Instead, it filled him with something quieter. Something warmer. Gratitude. He closed his eyes, letting himself remember, not just the moment she wore it, but the way she smiled when she caught him watching her, the way her voice dropped to a whisper when she talked to Lily, the way she hummed while folding laundry, that same green sweater hanging from her shoulders like a second skin. He hadn't realized how much he missed the ordinary things. This sweater had been just another piece of clothing once. Now it was a time capsule. A link. A reminder that she had been real, and close, and full of love. And that love hadn't disappeared. He didn't cry. Not this time. He just sat there, letting the memory settle beside him like an old friend he hadn't seen in a while. And he whispered, "Thank you." Not to the sweater. Not even to her. Just to the moment. For coming back to him without pain. The morning of Lily's birthday came with a soft drizzle tapping against the windows. It wasn't loud, just the kind of rain that made everything feel slower, quieter, more intentional. Jonathan had woken up early. Earlier than usual. He made pancakes, their travel tradition, and set the table with a single candle placed in the middle, nestled in a small dish of strawberries. Lily came downstairs with sleep still in her eyes and her hair messy in the back, but she smiled the moment she saw the table. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," Jonathan said, leaning down to kiss the top of her head. "Thanks, Daddy," she whispered, already eyeing the pancakes. They ate together. No rush. No phones. Just the sound of forks scraping plates and the occasional hum from the old kitchen radio. Afterward, Jonathan stood up and walked to the hall closet. He reached into the top shelf and pulled down a small wrapped package. It wasn't flashy. Just brown paper, tied with twine. But Lily's eyes lit up like he'd brought in a treasure chest. He handed it to her and sat back down. "This one's special," he said quietly. Lily nodded and began unwrapping it carefully, peeling the tape with precision like she didn't want to damage a single part of it. When the paper finally came off, she held a simple wooden frame in her hands. Inside it was a photo. A woman, her mother, smiling wide, eyes closed in mid-laugh, her hair windswept and her head tilted just slightly, as if the moment had caught her by surprise and joy had been the only honest reaction. Lily stared at it, frozen for a beat. Jonathan watched her closely, heart heavy and full at once. She turned the frame over in her hands, noticing a small engraving carved into the wood at the bottom. She ran her thumb along the letters, reading them silently first, then aloud in a soft, almost reverent tone. "You look like your mother, and that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Her eyes didn't water. She didn't cry. She just sat there, holding the frame against her chest, her small fingers curling gently around its edges. Then she smiled. And it was that same smile, the same unmistakable tilted expression from the photo. Quiet. Full of grace. Full of understanding far beyond her years. Jonathan felt something shift in him. Not shatter. Not fall. Just shift. Like a weight he'd been carrying had found a place to rest. "She was really beautiful," Lily said, not as a question, but as a certainty. "She was," Jonathan answered, voice barely steady. "And you are too." They sat like that for a while. No balloons. No gifts piled up. Just the photo. The candle. The rain. A birthday that didn't need more than the truth. Jonathan hadn't known if the gift would be too much. Too soon. Too heavy for her little heart to hold. But as he watched her tracing the edge of the frame again, resting her chin against the wood like it belonged to her, he knew he'd made the right choice. Not because it brought closure, but because it opened something new. A bridge. A bond. A quiet promise that they didn't have to hide from what they'd lost, because what remained was still so full of love. It was a Saturday morning when they went back. Same diner. Same time of day. The light streaming through the tall windows was just a little warmer than last time, and the spring air outside carried the faint scent of blooming jasmine. Lily held her father's hand as they walked in, not out of fear or habit, but with that calm assurance kids have when they feel safe. Jonathan had hesitated before stepping inside. Just for a second. But Lily didn't. She walked forward without looking back, and so he followed. The place hadn't changed. The tables were still topped with scratched menus and tiny syrup bottles, and the same soft hum of chatter and clinking dishes filled the space. But something in him had shifted. Last time they'd come here, he had been a man hiding behind silence. Now, he was just a father showing up with his daughter, and there was a quiet strength in that. Marian noticed them the moment they stepped through the door. She was wiping down a counter, hair pulled back in the same simple way, apron tied with a loose knot. She paused, not dramatically, not with surprise, but with recognition. Her eyes met Jonathan's briefly. No questions. No explanations. Just a small nod. One of those gestures that says more than words ever could. Jonathan nodded back. They chose the same booth. Lily slid in first, smiling at the familiarity of it, her eyes scanning the menu even though she already knew what she wanted. As they ordered, pancakes for her, coffee for him, there was an ease between them that hadn't existed before. The kind born not from forgetting, but from accepting. The kind that comes after truth has been spoken, and nothing heavy is left unsaid. Marian brought their drinks without comment. Just a smile. Warm, simple, real. Jonathan thanked her, and she moved on. Nothing more needed. They ate quietly, not because there was nothing to say, but because being together now didn't require effort. It just was. When they finished, Jonathan stood and helped Lily into her jacket. She glanced once more at their table, then looked toward the counter where Marianne was serving another customer. As they reached the door, Lily stopped. She turned, her voice suddenly louder than the hum of the diner. "Thank you for seeing my mom in me," she called out. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Marian looked up, startled, but only for a second. Then her expression softened. She didn't reply, just placed a hand over her chest and smiled, deeply. Jonathan stood still beside his daughter. Once, not long ago, he would have flinched. He would have hurried her out, avoided the moment, shut it down before it touched anything too fragile. But not today. Today he looked at his daughter, truly looked, and saw the pride in her face, the warmth in her voice. He saw her, the woman he had loved, alive in their child, not as a ghost, but as a presence. He smiled. Not a guarded, polite smile, but one full of memory, and peace, and gratitude. As they stepped outside, the door swung closed behind them with a gentle thud. The sky had brightened. The wind was soft. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan walked forward without needing to look away. Sometimes, what we run from isn't fear, it's memory. Not because we want to forget, but because we haven't been ready to remember. But memories aren't meant to be buried. They're pieces of the people we've loved. Still living in the curve of a smile, the glance of familiar eyes, and in a sentence that brings them gently back into the room. If you've ever seen a part of someone you lost, in the way your child laughs, or in the way a stranger speaks, then this story was for you. Hit like if it touched something real. Subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD for more stories that help us heal. One quiet, ordinary miracle at a time. Because sometimes, the smallest moments are the ones that bring us home.